Today, I want to focus on a pattern that I believe is one of the most significant in human history. Once you recognize it, much of what's happening in the Middle East right now starts to make sense. The pattern is straightforward. Every major empire that has attempted to conquer Iran, historically known as Persia, has ultimately failed. Some collapsed, others withdrew, and many were left permanently weakened. There are no real exceptions. Using ideas from game theory and structural history, I'm going to argue that the United States may be heading down the same path. To understand this, we need to look carefully at history. It doesn't repeat itself exactly, but as Mark Twain famously observed, it often rhymes. And in Iran's case, the rhyme is striking. Take Alexander the Great as a starting point. He's often remembered for conquering vast regions, including Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia itself. On the surface, it seems like a clear victory, but what happened afterward is just as important. Alexander died at only 32, and his empire quickly disintegrated as his generals fought among themselves. The Macedonian Empire didn't last, and in its place rose Iranian powers like the Parthians, who went on to dominate the region for centuries. The takeaway is simple. Even if Iran is defeated in the short term, it tends to outlast its conquerors. Next, consider the Roman Empire, arguably the most powerful military force of the ancient world. Rome fought Iranian empires for more than 3 centuries. Julius Caesar had plans to invade Persia, but was assassinated before he could act. Crassus attempted an invasion and suffered a devastating defeat at Carrhae in 53 BCE. Emperor Trajan managed to push deep into Persian territory, but uprisings forced him to retreat almost immediately. Later, Emperor Julian launched another campaign and was killed in battle. After centuries of conflict, Rome eventually fell, while the Persian Sasanian Empire was still standing. The Arab Caliphate provides another example. In the 7th century, Arab forces did succeed in conquering Iran. However, the story didn't end there. Over time, Iran absorbed its conquerors culturally. While Persians adopted Islam, they reshaped it in ways that reflected their own traditions. Persian contributions to art, poetry, philosophy, and science flourished. And within a few centuries, Iranian dynasties like the Buyids, Samanids, and Safavids reasserted control. Rather than being erased, Iran transformed the very forces that had conquered it. The Mongol invasions in the 13th century might seem like a clear counterexample given their sheer destruction. The Mongols devastated cities across Central Asia and the Middle East, including parts of Iran. Yet even here, the pattern held. Over time, Mongol rulers in Iran converted to Islam, adopted Persian customs, and became integrated into Iranian culture. The Ilkhanate, established by the Mongols, eventually became a patron of Persian art and literature. Once again, Iran absorbed the conquerors. In more recent history, the Soviet Union also struggled to maintain control over Iran. During both World War I and World War II, Soviet forces occupied parts of northern Iran. Yet in each case, they were eventually forced to withdraw. In 1946, Stalin attempted to keep troops in the region, triggering one of the first major crises of the Cold War. Even as a nuclear superpower, the Soviet Union could not hold its position and ultimately pulled out. All of this points to a consistent pattern. Iran is not just another nation-state. It represents a deep and enduring civilization with over 3,000 years of continuous cultural presence. Time and again, empires have tried to dominate it. And time and again, those empires have faltered while Iran endured. This isn't just coincidence or geography. It reflects deeper structural factors. One key reason is Iran's strategic depth. It is a vast Quick-Can, roughly 4 times the size of Iraq, with a population of around 90 million people. Its terrain is challenging, with mountain ranges like the Zagros and Alborz, along with deserts and other natural barriers. Military campaigns in such an environment are incredibly difficult. Napoleon warned against marching on Moscow. A similar warning could apply to Tehran. The sheer scale of resources required to occupy Iran would be enormous, far beyond what most modern armies can realistically deploy. Another factor is what can be described as an inverted military pyramid. Traditionally, successful military systems rely on large numbers of relatively inexpensive and flexible ground troops, supported by more specialized and costly assets like tanks, naval forces, and air power. Wars of attrition are typically won by those who can sustain their forces at the base of this pyramid. However, the United States has structured its military differently, placing heavy emphasis on expensive and technologically advanced systems like air power. This creates a situation where the most costly and least flexible elements sit at the foundation of strategy. According to this argument, such an approach may be less effective in prolonged conflicts, especially in a place like Iran, where geography and scale favor defense over occupation. This is why systems like the Patriot missile defense, despite costing billions, can still be bypassed by relatively inexpensive Iranian drones. The argument here is that the structure of the American military is not optimized for winning prolonged wars, but rather shaped by the incentives of the defense industry. Against a country like Iran, this becomes a serious weakness. The third factor is what can be called asymmetric cost exchange, and it may be the most damaging dynamic at play. Iran doesn't rely on traditional warfare methods. It leverages basic math. For example, a single Iranian drone might cost around $50,000. While an American interceptor missile can range from $3 million to $10 million, every time the US attempts to shoot down one of these drones, it is spending dozens of times more than Iran. And Iran doesn't deploy just one drone at a time. It can launch them in large numbers, overwhelming defense systems. In some cases, multiple interceptors are used against a single incoming missile, with no guarantee of success. This creates a race where the US must achieve its objectives before depleting its far more expensive resources. It's a strategy rooted in endurance, gradually draining the opponent rather than confronting it directly. Historically, similar approaches were used by Iranian forces against Rome, and the same principle is being applied in a modern context. The fourth factor is the will to fight, which may be the most critical element in any conflict. From this perspective, Iran is not simply acting as a state, but as a long-standing civilization with a deeply rooted sense of continuity. The narrative framing of the conflict, particularly in religious and cultural terms, adds an existential dimension. Wars require unity, capacity, and determination. The claim here is that Iran possesses all three. In contrast, the United States faces internal divisions with limited public support and political disagreements over funding and strategy. There are also concerns about transparency and how the human costs of war are communicated to the public. The contrast being drawn is between a country that has spent years preparing for a potential conflict, studying tactics, building capabilities, and planning responses, and one that may have underestimated the scale of resistance it would face. Another important point is that war is not confined to the battlefield. It operates across multiple dimensions: military, economic, political, and informational. The distinction made here is that the US approach tends to prioritize military action and expects other areas, like the economy or public opinion, to align with it. Iran, on the other hand, is described as using military actions in a way that directly influences economic conditions, political alliances, and global narratives. For example, control over key shipping routes like the Strait of Hormuz allows Iran to exert pressure on global oil markets, while selectively allowing certain countries to operate with fewer restrictions. This creates leverage that extends far beyond direct military engagement. Economically, rising oil prices and instability in energy markets can ripple across the global system. Concerns from major financial leaders about prolonged disruptions highlight how closely tied economic stability is to geopolitical tensions. Politically, regional alliances can shift under pressure as neighboring countries weigh their own security and economic vulnerabilities. Narratively, global public opinion becomes another battleground, where perceptions of the conflict influence support and legitimacy on both sides. At a deeper level, the conflict is framed as part of a larger challenge to the structure of global power, particularly the system that has supported the dominance of the US dollar in global oil trade since the 1970s. This system has allowed the United States to sustain its economic and military reach. However, disruptions in key regions, especially those controlling major and neft transit routes, can weaken confidence in that framework. If countries begin to question the stability or security of these arrangements, the broader financial system could feel the strain. The argument continues by pointing out the vulnerabilities of Gulf states, which depend heavily on stable shipping routes for food, water, and energy infrastructure. If these systems are threatened, their willingness to maintain existing economic relationships could shift. Over time, this could have cascading effects on global finance, investment flows, and technological sectors that rely on continued capital input. Historically, empires have often declined, not because they were defeated outright in battle, but because the cost of maintaining their influence became too high. The Soviet Union is frequently cited as an example, where prolonged economic strain, partly due to military commitments, contributed to its collapse. The suggestion here is that a similar dynamic could emerge if a powerful nation becomes overextended. Finally, the question arises, why not change course? Why not adapt strategy or pursue a different path? The explanation offered is that effective adaptation requires strong governance and long-term planning. The comparison is made between structured, multi-year planning processes in some countries and what is described as a more fragmented, short-term approach in the United States. Decisions with global consequences, it is argued, may be made without sufficient depth of analysis or preparation. In contrast, Iran is portrayed as having spent decades studying potential scenarios and building a strategy designed for endurance rather than quick victory. Iran has spent roughly 2 decades preparing for a conflict like this. Over those years, it closely studied the structure of the American military, identified and mapped U.S. bases across the region, developed drone production capabilities, and examined how American leaders tend to make decisions. From this perspective, Iran recognized several vulnerabilities: a limited tolerance for casualties, constraints in industrial capacity, and a political system that can struggle to sustain long-term commitment. Its strategy, then, was built to exploit exactly those pressure points. This reflects the contrast being drawn between a civilization that has adapted over thousands of years through repeated challenges and a modern superpower that has enjoyed decades of dominance and may no longer approach strategy with the same depth. Bringing all of this together, the argument shifts toward prediction, not as certainty, but as a framework based on historical patterns and strategic reasoning. 3 key forecasts are highlighted: a political shift in U.S. leadership, the outbreak of conflict with Iran, and ultimately a scenario in which the United States is unable to sustain the war. By losing, this does not mean a conventional battlefield defeat. Rather, it suggests that the cumulative costs, financial strain, political division, human losses, reputational damage, and economic disruption could reach a point where continuing the conflict is no longer viable. At that stage, a withdrawal from the region becomes likely. If such a shift occurs, the regional balance of power would change significantly, with countries like Israel and Iran emerging as the primary forces shaping the Middle East. The broader historical argument is that empires rarely collapse because of a single decisive battle. Instead, they decline gradually due to overextension, internal weaknesses, and the inability to sustain the burdens of maintaining dominance. This pattern has been seen repeatedly, from ancient Rome to more recent global powers. The same set of pressures, economic strain, political fragmentation, and strategic misalignment are presented as challenges facing the United States today. Meanwhile, Iran is portrayed as following a familiar approach, exercising patience, avoiding direct confrontation where possible, and allowing time and pressure to work in its favor. Historically, many powerful empires have entered Persian territory with confidence, only to see their influence fade over time while Iran endured. The closing idea emphasizes that this analysis is not meant to be taken as absolute prediction, but as an interpretation grounded in historical patterns and strategic thinking. The intent is to encourage critical examination, looking at the evidence, questioning assumptions, and forming independent conclusions about how such conflicts evolve and what they may ultimately lead to.